So to do this job, I do recommend getting a manual. You also need some common hand tools, some wrenches, a socket set, and a flathead screwdriver and a Phillips head screwdriver. You'll also need a torque wrench. As far as parts, I have a new cam chain, some gaskets, and the 88C big bore kit, cylinder and piston, and I also got some 10W30 Mobil 1 engine oil. So to get started, just remove these two 10mm nuts that are on the exhaust. Once those are done, go ahead and remove the spark plug. Go ahead and get that out of the way. Then I go ahead and remove the back number plate. And that gives you easier access to the rear mount for the exhaust. Now you can go ahead and remove the exhaust. Go ahead and set that aside. Then I just go ahead and remove the air box. It's just a few hoses and a hose clamp that you remove with a Phillips head screwdriver. Now I'm just removing these two 8mm bolts for the carburetor. Go ahead and remove those. Undo your throttle and then go ahead and remove the carb. Now I'm just undoing the shift lever here so I can gain access to the stator cover. And the stator cover is just held on by three 8mm bolts. Two of these are longer in the front, and then there is one that's shorter, so it does kind of help to put them back in their little holes. That way you know which ones go where. After that, you can go ahead and get to your flywheel and then set the motor to top dead center. That's this little T mark and then that little notch that's in the case there. Once you have your motor set to top dead center, you can go ahead and remove your lash adjuster covers. And then you can gain access to the valves. Then just loosen those two 9mm nuts that are on the intake valve and the exhaust valve. And then go ahead and back those out all the way so you have maximum valve clearance when you're removing the camshaft. Now you can go ahead and remove this 10mm bolt. This one goes all the way through the cylinder head to the other side to a cover for the cam gear sprocket. Go ahead and remove that. Then switching sides here, you can go ahead and remove the cover. And to break these loose, it helps if you hold the flywheel tight with one hand and then break these loose with the other. If your timing marks become misaligned, like mine did, go ahead and reset those, because you want to remove the camshaft while the motor is at top dead center. So once you have your marks back in line, go ahead and remove these two 8mm bolts. Then you can pop the camshaft sprocket off and then just kind of make sure you don't lose it and that the chain doesn't, drop down or anything. It's not really going to matter because going down there anyway, but, just kind of good practice. Now you can go ahead and reinstall your cam sprocket bolts. It just makes it easier to grab something so you can remove the camshaft. Then go ahead and remove the camshaft. It's also a good time to inspect your cam lobes and your cam bearings. Then I go ahead and remove this 10mm bolt on the side of the cylinder head here. And then I go ahead and remove these 4 10mm bolts on that hold the valve cover on and the cylinder head. And I remove these in an X pattern. And you also want to pay attention because the one that's on the bottom of the cam chain side is an open-ended nut, and it also has a copper washer. So you want to make sure that one goes back in the spot it was. And then again, also you want to loosen these in a crisscross pattern. And that's that bottom nut that's different, and it also has a copper washer. Once you have all those off, you can go ahead and remove the cylinder head. Let's give it a little tap here to break it loose. And then you can go ahead and remove it off of the 4 studs. Now you can go ahead and remove the cam chain roller. And then go ahead and set that to the side. Now you can remove this 10mm bolt on the cylinder. And then you can go ahead and just remove the cylinder. Now when you're going to remove one of these little circlips, it's always a good tip to stuff a paper towel down in the crank. That way this little clip can't fly down in there. So to remove it, I just turn it a little bit so there's not the opening in this little notch, and then get in that little notch, pry it out a little bit, and then turn the screwdriver sideways and just kind of go ahead and work your way around, and it'll just come right out. Then you can go from the other side and push the wrist pin out. Go ahead and remove the wrist pin and the piston. And here's a comparison size from the stock piston to the new one, and there's quite a big difference, so we're going to get some good power gains here. Now to remove this gasket, I'm also putting a paper towel in the cam chain side as well, and then I'm just using a razor blade here to get underneath the gasket and try and pry it away all in one piece if I can. That's always helpful. So there's really no tip or easy way to do this. You just kind of got to take your time and, you know, try and pry under it nice and evenly without cutting the gasket. Also, that little rubber O-ring you want to remove as well. And yeah, this is really the only way to kind of do this. And once you got it all the way off though, if you're lucky, you will be able to get the gasket off in one piece and you won't have a whole lot stuck to your gasket mating surface. I do recommend removing this bolt with the little piece on it. This does make it easier just to sand you know, your gasket surface so you don't have things in your way. So like this little corner especially, you know, makes it easier to get to. And then once you're done, you got it all sanded up. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, just clean enough. And then you also want to pay special attention to this little oil port there. That hole's very tiny, so you just want to make sure you don't get that clogged. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove my stator, my flywheel, and my stator and the cover, because I'm also going to be replacing my cam chain while I'm in here. My cam chain was stretched, and if you watch my other video, the cam chain roller was messed up and things like that, so I'm going to have to replace the cam chain as well. So to remove the flywheel, you do need one of these special Motion Pro tools, and they do go on counterclockwise, so they don't screw in like normal. They go reverse thread. And I also left the bolt on the crankshaft as well, just to make sure the crankshaft doesn't get any kind of damage. Once you have it threaded in, you can go ahead and grab the big side with a pair of pliers or a wrench, and then go ahead and grab a little wrench and then twist it until your flywheel pops off. You can go ahead and remove your tool and your flywheel nut. And then go ahead and remove your flywheel. And that tool makes it nice and easy to take off. So I definitely recommend getting one of those Motion Pro tools for the flywheel puller as well. Then to remove the stator, it's just two 8mm bolts here. And then there's also 8mm bolts on this wire here as well. And then go ahead and remove these two 8mm bolts as well. And that will allow you to move your stator far enough out of the way where you can gain access to this back cover here. Once you have access to this, you really want to you want to clean it up pretty good, and make sure that you know, no dust or particles are around there, because once you take this cover off, there's, you know, a lot of exposure to the inner workings of the motor. So you just want to make sure it's clean. It's actually a good tip to just go ahead and clean the whole bike before you even start any of this in the first place. So this cover is held on with two Phillips head screws, and you want to make sure you got the right size Phillips head for this job, because these are torqued down pretty tight and you just don't want to strip them out or anything. So once you have the right size Phillips head that you're confident it won't cam out of the holes or anything like that, go ahead and remove those. I also got my little T-shaped screwdriver here. This kind of just gives you a little more leverage and makes it easier to push in when you're turning these screws, so you don't strip them out. And that top one's really in there, so I just go ahead and break the bottom one loose first. And then this top one was pretty tight. You just want to push in as well, that way you don't strip it out. Then you can go ahead and remove those. And then you can just pry right here on these two little spots there and then remove the cover. Now you can see the full cam chain and the tensioner and the other idler gear and stuff like that. So now you can go ahead and remove the cam chain tensioner and then go ahead and remove the cam chain. So here's the bolt for the cam chain tensioner. And this spring does go in only one way with that tapered end facing towards the top, and then you go ahead and remove the plunger. And then go ahead and remove the cam chain. And I did put this old cam chain next to the new one, and it was stretched quite a bit. So now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the piston rings. These piston rings do go on a certain way, so you want to put them on with this R facing towards you, and the top ring is going to be the silver ring, and the second ring is going to be the black ring with this yellow marking on it. And the black ring is also a little bit wider than this chrome ring at the top. So if you're wondering, that's the way you're going to put the rings on. But you're also going to start with the oil ring first, and this oil ring does have little notches on the back that the two rails will ride against. So when you're installing the oil ring, you want to make sure you install this corrugated ring first. That way the rails are sitting on that back little notch there. It's kind of hard to see, but they're going to rest against that notch right there on the bottom and the top. So to install the oil ring, you just go ahead and put this corrugated ring on first. Then you can go ahead and install your rails for the oil control ring. Then you can go ahead and install your bottom rail. And then you can install your top rail. And they do make tools for installing rings, but I just install them with my hands. It's still pretty easy. You just want to make sure you don't bend it too much. And then also the gaps for this oil ring do have to be staggered a bit. So I'm just checking the old piston to see where those are at. And then I go ahead and make my gap a little bit farther on these oil rails. And then I just slide the bottom one over a little bit. So I ended up spacing them, basically one over here by these holes and then the other one over here by these holes. And that's how it was on the factory piston. So I'm pretty happy with that. So then you can go ahead and install your second ring. Again, you want to make sure that R is facing up towards you. And these rings are a little more rigid, so they're a little harder to install because you gotta, uncompress them so they can fit on. But I just kind of like get it in its little groove where it's gonna sit at anyway. And once you kind of get one end of the ring in there, you can kind of just, open up the ring kind of naturally, and it'll just kind of, fit right in there basically. So once you have one end like that, you can just pull the other end and it'll open up and go right where it needs to be basically. Then you can go ahead and install your top ring. This one's really easy. You just kind of get it in its little groove and pop it on. So when you're installing these rings, the piston into the cylinder, they do have to be staggered. And this is about where they'll sit anyway. I'd say that's probably about 40 degrees away from one another. And go ahead and reference your manual for that. And there is an easier way to kind of remember this when you're actually putting the cylinder on as well. And it has to do with those 4 studs. And I'll kind of, go over that when I'm installing the cylinder. But while I have the piston on the bench, it's easier to get one of these clips in here on the bench as well. So unfortunately, there's no like real easy trick to doing this. I do recommend kind of like keeping pressure on the ring with like at least one finger while you're trying to snap it into place. This kind of prevents it from, flinging off somewhere where you can't find it. So I always kind of keep pressure on it with one finger and then just kind of try and get it into its little groove in here. So this ring will expand into a little groove inside of here, and it'll just kind of snap into place. Compressing them is kind of the hardest part, and once they're under compression, they do, have the potential to fly off, so you just want to be careful with them. And then there it's in its little groove there, and the top is kind of a little past it, so I just go ahead and push it in. And then you want to make sure it's all the way seated in its little groove. Just kind of give it a good look around, make sure it's all the way in. And now we can go ahead and install our piston. You want to install your piston with the IN, that stands for intake. You want to make sure that's facing up towards the intake valve, or the carburetor side where gas would be going into the intake. And before I install this wrist pin, I also coated it with a fresh layer of oil. That just makes it easier to slide in. And you want to, put oil on all of your new parts. So now I'm going to go ahead and install this second little circlip here. And again, there's really no easy way that I know of to do this. Again, you want to make sure you have a rag stuffed inside your crank. That way the circlip couldn't fly in there or get inside your motor. And if you're stuck outside like me and this thing flies off in the grass somewhere, you're out of luck basically. You're never going to find it. So you just really want to be careful when you're doing this. And again, keep some kind of pressure on it with one finger at all times. That way, if it does kind of fly off, it doesn't fly as far or anything. So I get, one side in the little groove seated in there. Try and kind of hold it in place. And the weirdest thing about this whole thing is like you could fight with it for like 10 minutes and then when it goes, it just goes. So make sure that's snapped in and sitting where it should. Now I'm going to go ahead and install my cam chain. I definitely dunked this thing in some fresh engine oil. You can probably tell from my fingers there are all nice and shiny. So you want to coat that in some oil before you install it as well. Go ahead and install it onto the crank. Make sure it's on the idler gear and that it's sitting on the tensioner gear there. And I could have actually waited to do that until I had the actual cylinder on, but I went ahead and installed it anyway. And then this is the tensioner. It's hydraulic and there's a little ball in there, and that's why I shook it, because you want to make sure that's unobstructed and that you can hear that little ball in there kind of wiggling around. And I actually installed this cam chain tensioner a little early as well, because later on when I'm setting the timing for the cam gear sprocket, I do have to actually take the tensioner out. But that's neither here nor there. I went ahead and put it in anyway. Now I'm going to go ahead and install my new base gasket. Go ahead and install that. And again, like I said, I could have waited to install the cam chain, but I didn't. So it would probably, if you were doing this cam chain and this big bore kit at the same time like me, it would probably make it easier just to install a cylinder first and then go ahead and feed the cam chain through there. But I didn't. So, you know, hindsight's always 20/20. Go ahead and get your base gasket seated well. Push that dowel pin in. Then I'm going to go ahead and put my cover back on. I did lubricate the inner seal that goes around the crankshaft, and then I also lubricated, there's an outer seal that goes around this whole circumference of that cover. I went ahead and lubricated that with some fresh engine oil as well. Again, clean everything up. And then go ahead and install your 2 Phillips head screws. Go ahead and kind of, don't tighten one all the way down, kind of, you know, tighten one and then tighten the other one a little bit and then kind of go back down, because this cover will kind of push in as you're tightening those screws. Once that's done, you know, wipe away any extra oil that you had there. Then I go ahead and reinstall the stator. And I'm doing all this so I can reinstall the flywheel. That kind of gives me something to hold on to when I'm installing the cylinder onto the piston. So I just go ahead and put this little cover back on here that keeps this wire tucked away from the flywheel. I go ahead and put the pickup coil here on, and then its little cover. And then go ahead and make sure all those are tight. And then reinstall the flywheel onto its keyway. Might be a little hard, but you want to make sure that the flywheel is all the way on its keyway and sitting flush before you go ahead and put the bolt back on, because you could damage the threads or the nut when you're installing the bolt back on. So make sure the flywheel is all the way seated where it would sit naturally. Okay, and put your washer back on and your nut. I always hand thread this on quite a bit before tightening it down. So I always use an impact wrench. They do make a tool to hold the flywheel. That way you could use a regular ratchet. But I just use this little impact to take the bolt on and off. But that's why there are little holes on the flywheel, because if you don't have an impact, you could get that tool. I'd say it's just easier to use an impact, but anyway, there's also this little rubber oil seal here for that passage. So it wouldn't sit in there, so I dipped it in a little bit of oil, and that helps it stay put. And again, you want to oil this cylinder really good. I just kind of showed you guys that a little bit for demonstration purposes, but I really oiled that cylinder really well, and I even put a little bit of oil on the rings themselves. So now we can go ahead and install the cylinder. I kind of do this one ring at a time. So again, you want to make sure that first compression ring in gap is facing towards the stud on the crankcase side, that on the bottom of the crankcase side. So go ahead and, you know, put the end gap towards that bottom stud on the clutch side. And then go ahead and compress that ring. And they do make special tools for this, but again, I always just compress them with my hands. Once you get the first ring on, go ahead and make sure your second compression ring in gap is facing towards the top stud on the cam chain side. So if you look at that top stud there, you can see my compression ring in gap there, and I'm just pushing it in and it's facing towards that stud. So that's also an easy way to make sure your rings are staggered properly. So again, the first compression ring towards that bottom stud on the clutch side, and the second compression ring towards the top stud on the cam chain side. So go ahead and you know, make sure your piston's in there, and then again, I'm using the flywheel to kind of hold the piston still while I slide the cylinder on. And again, I kind of forgot about the cam chain there a little bit. Feed the cam chain through, and then go ahead and slide your cylinder all the way on. And those of you with eagle eyes would have seen that dowel pin fall off. I did end up finding it the next day, but I didn't see it when I was putting the cylinder head on. And here's a good look at all that excess oil down there on the bottom from having it coated on the cylinder and the piston rings. So you want to use, you know, quite a bit of oil when you're installing the cylinder. But go ahead and wipe that away, and then go ahead and install this 10mm bolt on the side here. Go ahead and snug that down. You don't have to torque it to spec or anything quite yet, but just make sure it's snug. After it's snug, I go ahead and you know, just let my finger guide the cam chain while I turn the flywheel and make sure that the piston's going up and down in the cylinder freely and it's moving around like it should. Now I'm going to go ahead and install the cam chain roller here. Get that set into place. This can be a little tricky when you're installing it. You also just kind of want to make sure it doesn't fall down into the motor a little bit. I'm sure it wouldn't fall too far down. You could probably fish it out with a screwdriver or something, but you know, go ahead and get that in place and get your 10mm bolt snug down. And I'm just making sure that it spins freely and you know, that it's not hung up on anything. So after that, you can, you know, wipe your gasket surface clean and then go ahead and install your head gasket. And then this little O-ring here as well. Again, I dip it in a little bit of oil to, you know, kind of hold it in place. And then I go ahead and install the cylinder head. I did clean up all these gasket surfaces here. Make sure they're all clean. Then go ahead and install the cylinder head on. I wish I would have realized about that other dowel pin, but it's not really a huge deal. They're just alignment dowel pins anyway. It's not gonna mess with the gasket sealing or anything like that. And I did find it and have it, so if I do remove the cylinder head in the future, I'll put it back in. So I went ahead and, put a screwdriver through that hole where the bolt goes, just to kind of hold the cam chain in place while I was putting the cylinder head on. Then I go ahead and put this 10mm bolt in. And again, you just kind of want to snug it down. You don't want to go ahead and torque it down all the way yet until you have your other 4 bolts on. After you have all 4 of those on, you can go ahead and, torque this 10mm bolt down and the other one that's on the cylinder head down. But now you can go ahead and install your camshaft. You want to install this with the lobes pointing down. That way the cam lobes aren't, touching the rocker arms or anything. Go ahead and install your camshaft and then remove these 2 8mm bolts. Now you can install the cam chain gear. Go ahead and get the cam chain up. And then when you're installing this gear, I find it the easiest way is to install it going from the bottom up. And you also want to kind of get your timing mark as close to where it's going to be anyway the first time around. So try and get your, mark kind of lined up there as well. Go in from the bottom, get the sprocket on there, and then go ahead and pop it over onto the camshaft. Pop it on, and you can see the timing mark is off. It's close, but it's not where we want it to be. So it is, close, and this is going to make it easier when you make the adjustment and everything. And here's where I realized I had to undo the cam chain tensioner as well. So I went ahead and did that, and then I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the timing marks are lined up. So go ahead and get the cam chain off of the cam chain gear and try and rotate the gear like 1 tooth at a time. Okay, get the that, and there it goes. Jumped 1 tooth. Get it back on the cam chain, and you can see the timing marks are aligned perfectly. Then to align the 2 holes for the camshaft with the cam chain gear, go through the valve cover and just turn the camshaft until those bolt holes align. Go ahead and install those kind of hand tight, and then go ahead and rotate your motor over 2 revolutions and make sure that your timing marks are still aligned. And that's 2 full revolutions coming up here. And boom, the timing work on the flywheel. Check that, make sure that's lined up. And then make sure your timing mark on the camshaft is lined up as well. And then go ahead and set the valve clearance. So the valve clearance on this, my manual says, is set to 0.03 millimeters on both the intake and the exhaust valve. So that's basically paper thin on the feeler gauge. So go ahead and insert that in between your valve and your rocker arm here. And once you have that inserted, you can go ahead and tighten up your lash adjuster. You want to make sure it's a little snug. You don't want to have it too tight up against the feeler gauge, but just snug. And I'll go ahead and include some volume here in a second so you can go ahead and hear what I'm talking about. But you want to feel a little bit of resistance when you're removing the feeler gauge. You want to be able to insert it freely, but feel a little bit of resistance when you're removing the feeler gauge. And then go ahead and snug your 9mm bolt there. And that sound is what I was talking about. You want to have just a little bit of free play as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove this 10mm bolt. This is the primer spot for the cam chain tensioner. And you want to go ahead and install like 2 to 3 cc's of clean engine oil into that primer hole there, and then reinstall the bolt. Go ahead and make sure that's snug down. Now you can go ahead and reinstall your lash adjuster covers. I put new O-rings on there and a little bit of engine oil as well on the O-ring. Go ahead and put a little engine oil on this O-ring as well. And then this one was not wanting to go in for me, but then there it goes. Once those are hand tight, you can go ahead and snug those with a 17mm wrench. And you want to make sure these are pretty snug, but you don't want to over tighten them. They're only aluminum and you could crack them. And then go ahead and install a new valve cover gasket. And then your valve cover gets installed with this arrow pointing down. There's one on the inside and an arrow on the outside as well. And again, that arrow goes on pointing down. And you can reinstall your 4 washers. And again, that copper one goes right here on this bottom stud on the cam chain side. And the other 3 don't matter. And again, this opened nut here goes on this bottom stud. And then the other 3 don't really matter. And then when you're tightening these down with your torque wrench here, again, you want to go in a X/crisscross pattern. That way your cylinder head goes on flush and seats down evenly. And I'll go ahead and include some volume here as well. That way you can hear the clicks on the torque wrench. So these get torqued down to 97 inch-pounds. And again, you want to go in that staggered pattern there. And there's a click. There's a click. Click. And once they're all torqued down, I just go over all 4 of them again just to make sure they're all, torqued to spec. And the cam chain roller bolt gets torqued to 88 inch-pounds. And these cam chain sprocket bolts get torqued to 80 inch-pounds. And again, it helps to hold the flywheel with one hand and then torque these with the other. And then also a good tip for your torque wrench is when you're done using it, go ahead and untighten it all the way down. So right now it's set at like, 80 inch-pounds, and then go ahead and untwist it all the way. That way there's no tension on it. That kind of keeps your torque wrench accurate for years to come. And that's just a quick tip. After that, you can go ahead and install the cover here for your camshaft sprocket. And you want to make sure that little tab is aligned there on the side of the cylinder head with the tab that's on that cover before you tighten it down all the way. And I am happy to report that this kit does run great with the stock jets. So I was really curious about that when I bought this kit because my bike does have, well, my son's bike has an FMF exhaust on it and this 88cc kit as well. And I was curious about rejetting, but this bike does idle fine. It's really throttle responsive, and you can go ahead and see the main jet is a 62 there. And then I'll go ahead and remove the pilot jet so you guys can see what size that is. And that is a 38. So if you're installing this on a 70cc bike, I'd say you have no issues with the stock jetting at all. If you're installing this kit right here on a 50cc bike, then, well, first of all, you're a madman, but you might want to go ahead and get some 70cc bike jets for it if it doesn't run right. And then here it is, ready to start up. The number plate's not even on the side here, but I'll go ahead and start it up here. And I'm really happy about that. It started up first kick, no problem at all. So as far as braking in goes / heat cycles, I let the bike run for about, 45 minutes there, and then I went ahead and shut it off. I put it up because it was getting kind of late anyway, and I didn't restart it until the next day. So it's the next day, it's a little rainy outside. And if you're interested in mechanical watches at all, go ahead and check out some of the other videos on my channel. I think watches and cars in general have a lot of overlap. And if you like mechanical things in general, you'll probably like mechanical watches. But here's the second startup for the second day. It's ice cold. And it started up first kick. Definitely has a lot more compression. And then I let it run for about another 45 minutes. After that, we just kind of rode it around about quarter throttle for about half a tank of gas, and the braking was pretty much done. And the good thing about this BBR big bore kit is that it works well with the BBR skid plate. So this skid plate, as you can see, is definitely going to save my old drain plug there. And the nice thing about it has some flush mounted hardware as well, so you don't have to worry about that getting all dinged up. So this little aluminum skid plate is pretty nice, and it's pretty cool that the big bore kit, kind of took that into consideration in the design. So it works well together, and I definitely recommend this aluminum big bore kit. You also save a little bit of weight as well. And I'll leave links in the description to eBay where I purchased the big bore kit and the skid plate as well, and anything else I can think of really. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.